Care Bear?
I'm an intensive care bear.
Why does a bear need a crowbar?
I don't like to get my hands dirty.
Okay, so Unicorn Wars was pretty awesome. After his feature debut with Bird Boy, Alberto Vasquez is back with another very, very weird movie. Right after finishing Bird Boy, Vasquez made a few animated short films. He took a lot of ideas from those and mixed it with one of his shorts he made early on in his career, similar to Bird Boy, then put everything together and fleshed it out to make his sophomore feature. I very much enjoyed his previous work, Bird Boy, The Forgotten Children, so much so that I even made a video about it. So of course I was very much looking forward to his second film. And yeah, this movie is exactly what you'd think a sequel to Bird Boy would be. Obviously, it's not a direct sequel, but it does share some similarities. A lot of the same themes and ideas do carry over onto Unicorn Wars. However, I'm pretty sure more people will walk away from this movie with a fuller understanding of what the filmmakers were actually trying to say. I'm also not trying to imply that this movie is a more dumbed down experience, because in some ways I might actually prefer this movie over Bird Boy. Alberto Vasquez at this point has proven to me that he is one of the top filmmakers to look out for, especially if you are an animation fan. His creative and very unique way of looking at the world through the lens of very childlike images makes his movie stand out among the more homogenized big CG studio films. Me personally, I love independent animation, or animation that is made on a more shorter scale than something like Disney or Pixar. Not only does it give an individual or set group of individuals more freedom to express themselves in aspects of visuals, themes, and character designs, they are also allowed to not have to market themselves to children. And trust me when I say Unicorn Wars is definitely not for kids. If given the freedom, animation can do so much more, but so much of it, at least in terms of the big studio films in the West, is overbloated with huge budgets that have to market themselves to as big of a general audience as possible. And they do this because that's the only way they can ever make back any sort of profit. That's why a lot of them feel very safe and formulaic. When I can, I want to support smaller scale animation projects like this, because if these people want to draw a little bear, they can do that.
From humble beginnings.
The inception of Bird Boy came from a short comic that led to a short film, which would accompany the feature film. The original short film serves as more of a prequel to Bird Boy, as it sort of explains the history of the world that Bird Boy takes place in. Unicorn Wars is actually a little bit different. It has a similar origin with a short called Unicorn Blood, but that film only serves as a basis to which the feature will eventually expand upon, which is the story about two brothers, the dichotomy between beauty and ugliness, both physically and emotionally, as well as the clash between civilization and nature. Both films use bears as a clear metaphor or stand-in for humans and how they treat and interact with other living beings. Something else worth mentioning is Vasquez's other short film, Homeless Home, which he made right after Bird Boy. Homeless Home is a film that looks at war and its effects on people. It portrays it as very bleak and life-consuming. This short might actually be the darkest thing made by this team, dealing with the repercussions of life after war, dehumanization, as well as domestic violence. Yeah, this thing is kinda heavy. I do recommend it though, and it is actually available here on YouTube along with the other shorts made by the same team. However, other than the war theme, there isn't much of a one-to-one comparison to what Unicorn Wars will eventually become in either style or narrative. Homeless Home is much more abstract than Unicorn Wars, but there is definitely a thematic flow between his work. Vasquez and his team are really good at mixing story and metaphor to portray characters and emotion in a very realistic way. The biggest stylistic difference between the two is their use of colors. Homeless Home is a story only seen in black and white, with red being the only hint of color, whereas Unicorn Wars is the exact opposite. If we go back to Bird Boy for a second, that film has a very muted color scheme and was often covered with heavy shades of black, and even its title character, Bird Boy, was colored only in black and white. They only used brighter colors like greens and pinks whenever there was a sense of harmony with either a character's memories or whenever a character was around nature. I personally really like the way Bird Boy looks. The use of color never felt out of place, and the more muted color scheme was a very good way of keeping the film's more somber and melancholic tone. Unicorn Wars, however, was designed from the ground up to be a lot more vibrant. This film uses a lot of monochromatic color schemes, like blues on blues, pinks on pinks, often to reflect the perspective of the character we are viewing the scene from, and when it decides to get extra colorful, it can get pretty crazy, from a very luscious and beautiful landscape to a completely insane psychedelic drug trip. Simply in terms of visuals, this is probably their best looking film. From what I can tell, the exact same team who worked on Bird Boy came back to work on this movie. And not only that, the budget is a lot bigger. With a bigger budget, the team was actually able to outsource some of its workload to other teams around Europe, while still managing to keep a very unified vision. A lot of the problems with working in animation is having to utilize different softwares for very specific things. 2D, 3D effects and models have to be made with one program, then rendered and exported to another program. The animation team mitigated this problem as much as possible by using Blender. In fact, the vast majority of this movie was made only with Blender. From 2D animation, 3D models and backgrounds, all the way to the finishing touches was all done on Blender. The decision to mix 3D and 2D makes a lot of sense. The movie is called Unicorn Wars, and with a title like that, we can expect at least a few horse-like creatures to appear. So for starters, if you follow any animation-based channels or just know about the process of animation, then you would know that horses are infamously very hard to draw, even as still images, let alone having to animate them.
You know, you look at horses and they're very complicated. There's muscles everywhere. To animate the sort of things we had to animate, we had to be able to fully understand how horses work.
It does make a lot of sense both scheduling wise and financially to go 3D for the unicorns. And you know what? They look pretty good. And yes, you can tell they are 3D, there's no denying that. But the movie does actually do a pretty good job of not trying to hide it, but instead utilize it. It uses it as a way to separate the unicorns from other animals in this world. They have a very ethereal vibe to them, so the fact that they do stand out is to their benefit. Also, I am saying they stand out, but really they do look good. They are completely stylized to resemble only the silhouette of a horse and are completely painted black. This was pretty much done for two reasons. Reason one is if they are only in silhouettes, it is easier to hide any sort of imperfections in the models or the rigging. And reason two, it was used as a stylistic choice to pay homage to a pioneer of animation. Alberto Vazquez said that his main inspiration for the look of this film is the work of filmmaker Lotte Reininger, whose work helped start the animation movement as we see it now. Her work was very simple but very effective, especially for its time. Essentially, it's a mix of shadow puppets and stop motion. She used a light table and she cut out paper figures and took frame-by-frame pictures of their movements. This very early example of animation focused on emphasizing silhouettes and the contrast between light and darkness. The unicorns in this movie use this technique, and it is thanks to this very primitive way of animating that allows the unicorns to look as good as they do. For me, sometimes even just good aesthetics and presentation can carry the experience of a film. There are times where all I really need is a good tone or mood that a piece of art can give me, but I do know that most people need a little more to chew on. So do I dare ask, what is Unicorn Wars actually about? So I guess for starters, I really want to look at one character in particular, and that of course is Bluey, the second of the two brothers. He's he's a silly little guy. And yes, there is a reason why I said second. Bluey is both very prideful and very insecure. He lives a life with a constant need to prove himself, which drives him to act the way he does. However, Bluey isn't just born evil, no one really is. Bluey's outlook on life is brought upon by a lack of awareness on his father's part, because sometimes trauma isn't consciously inflicted. Sometimes you are never fully aware of the outcome of your good intentions. This isn't a scenario where his father trained Bluey to act this way, more that his father's own insecurities was passed down onto Bluey. While on a fishing trip, Bluey asks why his father and mother are getting a divorce. His father tells him that love is complicated and that losers can't have love, then eagerly tells his son not to be a loser. It is very clear that his father only says these things because that is probably how he sees himself. Of course, without realizing this moment was Bluey's turning point as a person. After this, Bluey became very bitter and hateful to his mother, often feeling like her love was always out of reach. This is why we find that he always has to flaunt everything that he feels he has superiority over. At the beginning of the film, he flaunts his beauty, saying that no one can ever match it. And later he shows off his marksmanship skills to get praise from his superior officer. Bluey isn't the best at everything. I mean, no one really can be. Whenever he is confronted or challenged, his response is only to act violent and destroy that which questions his merit as a winner. During the first half of the film, Bluey has a lot of animosity for a bear named Coco, a hatred that bubbles out throughout the film. Coco being someone who has shown overwhelming results as a soldier, as well as being someone who is willing to confront Bluey for his actions. In Coco's final moment of vulnerability, Bluey takes a chance to kill him, not out of mercy, rather to end the life of someone who he feels questions his value as a person. For Bluey, he can't be second, cause second isn't good enough, not even to the one person who was always first in his life. Tubby is, on the other hand, the exact opposite. He is kind, loving, and very gentle, always very aware of other people's feelings, and he tries his hardest to ensure the well-being of others. That empathy even extends to those who are supposed to be his enemies. He's not very violent and even has a hard time standing up for himself. Tubby wasn't there on the boat to hear his father's words on how to obtain love, so he never felt as if his mother's love was ever anything he had to earn. Unlike Bluey, who began to hate his mother and always rejected her attempts at showing genuine affection for him, Tubby was always the one to embrace his mother, which caused Bluey to believe that his mother always favored his brother over him. The hatred he felt towards his mother eventually manifested and was pushed onto everyone else around him, the soldiers, the unicorns, and even his brother. This vindictiveness is always on full display, even if it doesn't involve violence. In the middle of the night, Tubby wakes up his brother to tell him that he wet the bed. Bluey immediately comforts him and tells him to sneak out with the sheets, put them in the wash, so no one will ever find out. Tubby praises his brother's advice and does what he is told, only for Bluey to turn on the lights and humiliate his brother in front of everyone. This causes him to be called bedwetter and be laughed at by his whole platoon. This scene is great because we get to see both brothers' morals on full display. We find out later that it wasn't Tubby who wet the bed, but in fact it was actually Bluey. We are never told if Bluey actually knew he wet the bed, or if he genuinely believed that Tubby was the one who wet the bed. And in some way it doesn't really matter, because in this moment we understand just how much Tubby tries to look after his brother. Tubby lies to his brother and takes responsibility for wetting the bed. He does this to save his brother's ego and ensure his reputation is saved. And on the other side, Bluey's first action was to find some way to bring someone down. This is very cruel. Not only does Bluey not get anything from this, but his own brother now is given a very humiliating label. This sort of dual nature is at the core of the film, the dichotomy between two opposing forces. The other aspect of the film is its theme on war and religion. The war itself is caused by a religious crusade. In the bear scriptures, it is believed that the unicorns hold the key to immortality and eternal beauty, which can only be achieved by killing the very last unicorn and drinking its blood. And this shows us that the unicorns are not in this war for any sort of selfish desire or political discourse, but instead only to ensure their own survival. This makes the war less of an actual war and more of a purge on the bear side. From the beginning, we see the unicorns in a very sympathetic light. They aren't violent by nature, they're a part of the world and deserve to exist. But from the bear's point of view, that does not matter, because ending their lives provides something much more valuable, even if their actions bring forth some very dire consequences. This theme of corrupting nature exists in all of Vasquez's previous films, as well as the aspect of human relationships, and often focusing on the dark side of both, because sometimes ambition is what causes humans to be ignorant on the effects they have on the world. Sometimes your own pain or beliefs are what create a divide between you and the people you love. And sometimes, no matter how hard you try to do good, there will always be evil that will try to hurt you. And maybe evil will always exist. Time and time again, this theme is explored in Vasquez's films. However, he never lets his films completely drown in nihilism. There is always something there, something that will always be there to bring forth change and a better perspective on the world. Tubby is, for all intents and purpose, this film's punching bag. He is humiliated and used, He is betrayed and hurt, but he always tries for the sake of others. Out of the two brothers, he is the one who grows, and he learns how to be more confident and to confront others for their wrongdoings. And he does this without ever losing that compassion that makes him who he is. Tubby, in more ways than one, is a type of martyr. He would rather be humiliated himself than to let his brother suffer any sort of pain. This all culminates at the end of the film where, after an intense battle, Bluey becomes malformed and seeks vengeance on the unicorns. Tubby, at the end of the film, chooses to reject his brother and instead protect the very last unicorn, the same unicorn he found and chose to nurture back to health. Bluey, in anger after seeing his brother turn his back on him, the same brother who always stood by his side even through all the cruel things he has done to him, he decides to end that pain. Bluey is someone who fits a more conventional image of cute and beautiful. Tubby, of course, is designed to be the exact opposite. He is not very cute, and he is clearly drawn to be fat, if you couldn't tell by the name. They are the antithesis of each other, always opposing and running parallel throughout the story. Tubby dies from an act of kindness, and Bluey dies from an act of selfishness. The last unicorn is killed, and Bluey drinks its blood, and something new from that is born. Something that has been foreshadowed throughout the movie. So this final part is my personal interpretation. You are free to agree or disagree to any extent. Like most stories with anthropomorphic designs, they are used as a metaphor or a stand-in for something else. However, this movie isn't really a one-to-one with its comparison. The bears, in my opinion, don't uniformly represent humans, and the unicorns don't just represent nature or animal life. If we take the narrative in a very literal way, we get a story about the civilized bears fighting the more spiritual unicorns. The bears end up winning, and the death of the last unicorn brings forth the birth of something new. The bears do inhibit some aspects of humanity. The development and modernization of society, greed, jealousy, and malice, as well as kindness and forgiveness. The bears to me are just one part of what makes up a human. As time moves on, sometimes we forget that humans are a natural part of the earth, and some people will disregard it for their own selfish needs, while some are also willing to help and understand the earth and the creatures who live in it. The unicorns also inhibit some aspects of humanity. They also need companionship and long for maternal love, and also fear for what may come in the future. When using metaphors, sometimes you can get lost in your own intentions. You might want to portray an aspect of humanity that you find ugly or scary, and in doing that you might end up losing a lot of the nuance that comes with it. And when that happens, you might end up portraying a very simplistic depiction of that problem. The writer often risks just hand-waving a solution or portraying a problem as something that can be easily fixed. This film, however, never lets what it's trying to portray be the complete purpose of the film. Even if you personally don't see or care for any of the metaphors, what you do get is still a compelling story about nature versus nurture. So if we look at the ending and try to interpret something out of it, what actually happens? The bears and unicorns all die and give birth to a new creature. And just who the hell is this new creature?
I have combined the DNA of the world's most evil animals to make the most evil creature of them all.
It turns out it's man.
See, this right here is why I think bears and unicorns are both supposed to represent humanity. In this ending, in order for humanity to exist, all aspects of it have to come together, with all of its hatred and malice, but also its kindness. Sometimes it can be very easy to get drowned up with a lot of negative thoughts on humanity, and just see the very bleak part about it. But kindness and empathy is also aspects that humans possess. When I said everything had to be absorbed to create humanity, I do mean everything. Even Tubby, the one character who has shown overwhelming love, is needed to finally complete this ritual. I also find it very interesting that the death of these childlike icons, unicorns and teddy bears, is what's needed to complete this prophecy. When you're an adult, you can't keep looking at the world the same way. Things become a bit darker, you know of the dangers that exist there. This is how the use of metaphor fully comes together in this movie. The bears in this movie are very cute and are made up of a lot of circles and round shapes. They look like something you would find at a kid's toy store, very reminiscent to something like Care Bears. The unicorns also resemble something that could be sold for girls. I mean, ponies being one of the most popular type of toy that is marketed towards girls. So for the movie to kill all of these symbols of childhood makes the use of anthropomorphic designs that much better. because this aspect is both tangible for the story, but it also works as a sort of meta aspect for the narrative. And yes, humans were the real monsters all along. I know, that's kind of a cliche, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. Cliches aren't inherently bad. What's bad is when they are used as a crutch to bring forth familiar feelings to an audience without any attempt to either subvert or develop that trope in any sort of meaningful way. And you know what, this movie does use it in a meaningful way, and it also doesn't beat you over the head with it. The movie trusts you and your intelligence to at least walk out of it with at least some sort of interpretation of your own. Again, this is just me and what I think. You can completely agree or disagree, and that's perfectly fine. The last thing I have to mention is something that wasn't very present in Bird Boy, which added to my personal enjoyment of this film. Bird Boy was a movie that I watched with a very somber mood. When watching it, I felt as if I was watching like an art house film and analyzed it as such. But during my watch through of Unicorn Wars, I'm not gonna lie, this movie genuinely made me laugh my ass off.
Gordy. ¿Qué? Digo que si quiere, puede verme el pitito. No, 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 no. No, Gordy.
Bird Boy was a film that made you look for its meaning. Even if you didn't get what that movie was about, you can still tell that it had something to say. Unicorn Wars is actually a much more enjoyable film, and yes, it does have something to say. You just have to search it underneath the layers of little bear to really get any meaning out of it. And that's kind of why I prefer this film. Don't get me wrong, I love Bird Boy, and objectively, I think it might actually be the better film overall. However, Unicorn Wars sort of fits a certain type of storytelling that I personally really enjoy. It's a movie that is very rich with thematic meaning, but it's also not afraid to revel in its own absurdity. Listen man, it's a movie about little bears tripping balls and going to war. This movie has no shame in being absurd and silly, and that is something that I'm always searching for in the media that I watch. Some of my favorite pieces of art ride this line where they can be analyzed and deconstructed, but they're also very silly and conceptual with wild tone shifts. And films like this have no concern that their less serious moments will take away from the work's overall message. You can look at this film and see nothing but silly little bears killing each other, or you can go into it with a more analytical lens. This movie far exceeded my expectations, which, you know what, to be fair, I genuinely had no expectations. And not because I thought this movie was gonna be bad or anything, it's just I don't really have any expectations for anything anymore. I mean, hey, listen, if you don't expect anything, you probably won't be disappointed. For a follow-up to Bird Boy, this was amazing. It perfectly built upon the ideas that Bird Boy had, while also trying something different. And as a bonus, I think this is a much easier film for a more casual audience. Not to say that it's simpler or dumbed down, I just think that it's an easier film to recommend. The same type of audience who watches Adult Swim would probably really like this movie. Whereas something like Bird Boy might be a little too slow and a little too moody, Unicorn Wars can appeal to the goofy stoner demographic while also having enough substance and style for a more art house film goer. So pretty much the best of both worlds. Or you know what, you could be like me and just watch anything.